Today, I'm gonna break down this 3D intro animation I made using Blender and After Effects. This was made to be used as an intro for an educational series about the Albanian language, where it takes you through the basics, common grammar mistakes, analysis, and so on. It was really lovely making this show and a fun challenge to be able to write the scripts, shoot, edit, illustrate the information with 2D graphics, as well as create a 3D animation intro for it. You can watch the final episodes through the link in the description. If you're new around here, in this channel we talk about motion design, visual effects, and filmmaking in general, so consider subscribing, and if you're interested, you can check out previous videos that usually come with project files that you could use for your own work. Additionally, you could support us by becoming a member and gaining access to all of those project files for free. We love making these videos and sharing them with you guys, so please do share it with other people as well. Leave a like, comment with any questions you might have. And with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so here we are now in the computer, and what you see here is PureRef, a free software for gathering reference for your projects, and I pretty much use this every time. So you can see here I got some 3D environment images I gathered from all over the internet. I did not end up using all of these elements, but it's always great to have them laid out so you don't just rely on your memory when it comes to making things in CGI and matching them to real life, because this intro in particular is supposed to be realistic. So, I never trust my memory because I always end up butchering things when I do something from scratch and don't take a moment to look at any reference. It's also a nice source of inspiration, and you can get ideas from different kinds of places, mash them together, add your own sauce and everything, and then come up with a brand new idea. Because let's face it, nowadays you don't really get to see pure 100% original work. People are always borrowing ideas, and that's not a bad thing. You just avoid copying something 100% because that's just stealing at that point. Now, before we move on, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So, if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. And here we are now in Blender, and I want to take a moment to first talk about a very specific topic, which is assets. And usually you see this argument online, and it gets very heated sometimes, where you have some people on one side saying, you shouldn't use any assets because then that's not your work. They completely discredit everything else. And then there's the other side where they go, yeah, assets are fine, we use them all the time, me included. Now, by all means, you can go ahead and create everything from scratch if you want to, if that's something you like and you have the time for it. But making use of pre-made assets, it's just such a time saver, and it doesn't really take away or devalue your work, because even if you end up using all the assets and making up a scene and nothing in there is originally made, you're still having to combine them together and place them and composite a shot and then animate them or whatever. So in the first place, that's why assets are made, so you can use them and speed up your workflow, save yourself some time. And then of course you can go ahead, dive in and make any changes if you want to, modify them, just to, I guess, make them a bit more your own, so people can't identify, oh, there's the asset, I've seen this somewhere. But to go back to that point of you having to still put in the effort, regardless if you use assets or not. As for the time management, for this project specifically, I had about 1 week until the first episode was supposed to air. And during that week, I had to finish the intro animation, the edit, color, audio mixing, and all that, and have it ready. So it didn't really make sense for me to go ahead and model everything from scratch, because also, to be honest with you, my modeling skills aren't too great. So let's say this desk, for example, it probably would have taken me a whole day to model. And even then, it might have not looked as good as this asset. Now, I do want to point out one thing, and that is that if you're using models from different sources, so different websites or whatever, just make sure that you have a consistent style, because I don't know if you've seen those kids shows where they use a high poly model of something and then there's a low poly cartoony looking model on the other side, and they're just using them on the same scene. And the last point before we go ahead and take a look at these assets is that by using these, I can try different things, because there's usually a large library of all sorts of models available nowadays, and see what works, instead of having to model something for 3 hours and then realizing that, oh, it actually doesn't work, and then deleting it. You get a bit emotionally attached to something you spend a lot of time in, and then you just can't let it go, even though you probably know that it doesn't work for this scene. All right, now let's finally take a look at all of these objects I got in here. So starting off with the room, I'm gonna go ahead and isolate it. You can hit the / to go into isolation view. And this is basically a box with the top and the right side missing. And then I'll go ahead and switch to render view. And then we can even hit 0 to go into the camera view. Now let me split this view here so we can toggle the UI elements and then go back out. So the whole thing with the room is that I didn't need it to be an actual detailed classroom, let's say, because that was the point. This is supposed to be a classroom, because you can't even see them in the final shot. So why bother? And then I also made sure to add proper materials. So you can see it's kind of like a wood texture, because Blender works based on real life physics. So light bounces around, and depending on what materials you use, what textures you use, those colors are then going to be bouncing around. So even though we don't see these walls, it bounces the light and it blocks the light as well. So let's go into edit mode with tab, just to focus on this view here. Delete the faces. You see how much light is coming in now? Because it's the HDRI blasting a bunch of light from this side. But I don't want that. I want it to be able to control the lighting. Now for the assets, I used mostly or pretty much only Polyhaven models. Polyhaven is this website that provides HDRI's textures and models. All of them are usually for free, but you can also support them with Patreon, and then you get like early access. And then they have a built-in add-on for Blender, which I can switch to if I make some room here. Let's go to Asset Browser and then switch to Polyhaven. And how it works is at the start, once you install the add-on, you download their entire catalog, and then you have them stored in your local drive. And then you can just access them real quick and even search for them up here and then drag and drop them real quick. So let's say drag these books, and there you have them immediately in your scene. So for example, I use this plant, I use this chair, I use this desk. Then I have some models on the table that I created from scratch because they were relatively simple. We got an eraser, which is just a rectangle. We got a pen, which is a cylinder extruded. The book asset was made by this guy, Max Edge, with geometry nodes. I did try at first to create a book from scratch, just like do the bare minimum so I can have the animation I wanted. But this ended up saving me so much time, and it's so well made to the point where I could easily animate it because it has all sorts of controls. And best of all, he gives it away for free. Now, of course, I would highly recommend you give a tip, but this is just insane. So I brought that in and then customized it, added my own pages because you can do that. Then it was a matter of positioning them and scaling them up properly. So we got a balanced composition and everything looks like it's set to real life size. So if I go over to, let's say, the last frame here where the camera sits in its final position, the chair is off to the side so it doesn't attract too much attention, but it's also slightly rotated just to give a sense of imperfection because we don't want to keep everything in line. Everything in 3D is perfect. You're supposed to add those imperfections to match the real life because in real life, nothing is perfect. Now, of course, it depends on what you're working on and what the concept is. You could be doing some stylized CGI stuff where you want things to be perfect. But in this case, I had to make sure that there's grunge, there's dirt, things are misaligned. And to make it easier for myself to set a composition and position objects and set the size and everything, I usually use two views. One is for what the camera sees. Additionally, you could even pop open a new window and then let's say set this to the camera view and then drag it to the second monitor, for example. As for the textures and materials, again, I only used Polyhaven assets. Go to the textures. You can simply drag and drop something into a model. Now, of course, I did have to go in and tweak the size and the orientation of the texture. I even tried out different materials at first. So I believe I was using this kind of wooden beam wall or whatever it's called. And if I switch to the shader editor, you can see it adds a bunch of these nodes, and you can go ahead and click and drag down to select all 3 of those values and then drag to the left while also holding down shift for finer control. At the same time, you can look on the left view there just to get a proper scaling. But then the wood was looking a bit too much because we have wood on the main platform, which is the desk that's holding the main character, in this case, the book. And I thought there was not enough contrast. It was blending in with each other. So I ended up using a concrete material instead, and it just makes the desk pop a bit more. The chair has this sort of bluish color, and sure, I could have shifted the hue or something, but I actually quite like the blue color because it's got the good contrast between cold tones and then warm tones of the desk. So color theory, colors on different sides of the spectrum. Now for the textures on the book, we're gonna first have to go over to After Effects. Here you can see all the different pages I had, which I first had to key out. So let me just isolate one of these. You can hit F4 to toggle the switches and then disable the matte. And then we can disable all of the effects. So first of all, I added some contrast and saturation to bring out these colors. And then finally, I used the Luma key to key out the brighter parts, which in this case are the paper because it's mostly white. So I then exported each of these pages individually, brought them over to this other comp, where I composited back the paper background, which I got as a texture from somewhere, I don't remember, and then also added some additional contrast on top with an adjustment layer. Now you might be able to notice some of these lines, which are from the original paper, so the divider lines, but these things pass on very quickly and usually you don't even notice those, so it's not a huge deal. And finally, I exported each of these pages as individual images and brought them into Blender, applied it to the book by following the instructions that they give. I believe you're supposed to set the number of images you have for the pages, so then it calculates it properly. Now let's talk about the lighting in this scene. So as I zoom out, you'll be able to notice this gobo texture. Gobo is basically a texture that you put in front of your lights to make a scene look a bit more interesting. So I'll go ahead and disable the gobo spotlight and look how bland that looks. Or in fact, let me just disable the gobo itself and leave the light. So you can notice the light intensity or the power is actually quite high, but because we put a gobo in front, I had to do that just to have enough light push through in between these transparent areas. But this adds so much more depth and realism to the scene. To create the gobo, I brought in this image and then added some turbulent displace with an evolution animation. So it looks like there's some wind, because if this was just a static image, sure, you would get that doppled light all over the scene, but with just a little bit of movement, you're able to breathe some more life into the shot. So that was exported as an image sequence, and I brought it in and applied it to this plane. And this is the very basic node setup. I'm not even using any colors, it's just to drive the transparency of the plane. Apart from the gobo light, there's also an accent light, which you can see is a spotlight with a very small radius, just to keep it focused on the book, because I wanted to draw more attention to the center of the frame. That's with and without the light. Then we also have a fill light on the other side. It was a bit too dark, so I just had to pump up those shadows. Then, as I mentioned before, we have an HDRI, which again is from Polyhaven. I rotated it slightly just to get a matching light direction, so you can see that's where the majority of the light is coming from in the HDRI. You know, I had to match that with the real lights in the scene. But there was some depth missing, so I decided to add a volumetrics cube with a volume material. So if we go over to the shader editor and make sure that this is selectable, you can toggle these different buttons by going up here and restriction toggles, because usually I don't think you can see these, but then you can toggle them on, and I don't know why they're not on by default. I guess to avoid a visual clutter. So if I select this, you see it has a simple volume scatter node, and then I went into the viewport display under object and make it so it displays as bounds in the viewport instead of textured or solid, because then it interferes with you selecting other objects, whereas with bounds, I can now easily select anything else I want. And again, let's go ahead and disable the selectability, so now you can't really click on it. So with and without. Now for the animation, we can go ahead and switch to the viewport shading so we can preview that a bit faster. So there's not really a lot going on besides the book animation. We got a simple dolly out from the camera and it tilts and constantly looks at the book. And speaking of looking at the book, if I go over to the outliner here under camera look at, we have the camera, and this is using a constraint track 2, which is the camera look at object. If I move the camera around, it's gonna constantly keep looking at the book. Additionally, it is also parented to the camera look at, which is also animated. I can hit Control Tab to toggle between the timeline and the graph editor. And you can see I have scale values here. So if you have the camera parented to an object and you scale the object, it zooms it out. And I'm using the wrong term here because zoom is the camera staying locked in and then zooming in with a lens. But this is actually moving the camera physically closer and further away. So it's dollying in and out, I guess. And then you can also see a focus object here, which I used for the depth of field. And depending on where this focus object is in the scene, that's where the focal plane is going to be of the camera. That's where it is right now. So the focus is on the page. If I move it up a bit, so if I were to say bring the eraser right there, the eraser is going to be in focus. Oh, that looks so trippy. And of course, we got the book animation. Now, there are a bunch of keyframes here because I had to dial in the book animation with the pages and everything. And it took some time to get used to how the geonodes was set up. But I think in the end, it turned out pretty good. You know, I was also trying to match it to the sound, so the music that I chose beforehand. And real quick, that reminds me, I've disabled it currently. But if we go over to video editing, we can right click on this track, unmute the strip. So now when I play the animation, yeah, you can hear it and you can use that as reference to kind of line up the timing of the animation with the music, or if you also have sound design. I also animated the lights because at the beginning I wanted things to fade in from black. We start off with this dark looking scene, and then as we move forward, the glossy reflection on the table kind of shines in, and then we also have the accent light coming in. Now, there is one thing I should have looked out for and made a change because it kind of bugs me out a bit. You can see there's like a double shadow here, and that's because I'm using one light with the gobo, which is casting shadows, and then another light in front, which casts another shadow because of the different angle and positioning and all that. And we get this kind of ghosting effect, which I'm not really a fan of. So that's one of the things that I would change if I were to go back to this. If you have the time, go back and analyze the previous work that you've done and just see what you would improve, because it really helps, you know, to analyze and look at things in hindsight and say, oh, okay, this doesn't look quite good and maybe next time I can do something else. And it can be a really valuable personal mentorship with yourself, let's say. And one last thing about the animation is that I duplicated the camera and baked in all the movements. So you can do that by, let's say, selecting the camera and going over to Object, Animation, Bake Action, and then you can say clear constraints, clear parents, clear everything, set the start and end frames, and that will add a keyframe to every single frame on the timeline to this camera. But now you've got this singular camera that's not parented to anything, it doesn't have any constraints. And what I did was to send this over to After Effects, and keep in mind that I did this only when I knew for sure that the camera animation is final. So here's the camera with all of the baked in keyframes, and then I added a solid on top with the Optical Flares plugin from Video Copilot and used a 3D light to guide this. So you see it says track lights, and then it reacts to the camera position. So nothing here is manually animated. I just set the position of the 3D light to get the proper lens flare I wanted. As the camera was moving, it was reacting accordingly. And here I have the original render at the bottom, which is set to be a guide layer. So it doesn't render in any other compositions. And we can set this to be add, for example. There you have it. Now there's only two things left to be discussed, and that's the rendering, the render passes, and the post-processing effects. So for renders, you can see I have two view layers. One is main, which is what you see here, and that's everything apart from the particles. And then on another view layer, I only have the particles visible, and the models are set to be indirect only. So, you know, they interact with the particles, they cut out where the particles aren't supposed to be visible. I use the particle system, and then this is the particle instance. So let me zoom into it. Yeah, it's just this low poly sphere, because if you're going to be using a particle system and you're going to be instancing a bunch of the same object, you don't want high poly object as an instance, because then that's going to be trillion amounts of polygons. And you want to make sure you disable it from the render, just in case it's like near to the camera view, so it doesn't show up and it's just a floating blob. And I actually used this tutorial as a guide to help me create the particle system, which I'll leave the link to in the description. And those were the only two view layers. And then for exporting, I used an OpenEXR RGBA, so I can make use of the transparency for the particles. And in fact, I would recommend you use this combination of settings for rendering, because it's a relatively low file size with a very high quality, so there's not a lot of compression. And again, to refer you to the tutorial from where I got the information, Polyfjord real-time EXR workflow, I highly recommend it. There's a lot of juicy information in this video. And the reason I'm saying you should always export as an image sequence is because usually with high detailed scenes, there's a big risk of your computer crashing as it's rendering. And if you were to render a video, that whole file is corrupted and now you can't really continue it. You have to start from scratch. Whereas if you export as an image sequence, even if it crashes on, say, frame 30, at least you have 29 images rendered and ready to go. And you can set the render to continue from frame 30 onwards. Finally, in After Effects, I first brought in the music, the individual render layers, which are the particles and the main one. And you can see, because I used an OpenEXR multi-layer format, it allows you to store multiple view layers inside of one file. But then we use the extractor plugin from After Effects, and we can choose which view layer we want to use. And then I also had to linearize it, because without that it looks weird. And then I also used the OpenColor.io plugin to make sure I'm working in the correct color space and gamma, which is Filmic sRGB. Now, I know in Blender 4.0 now they have introduced AGX, but this was created during the time where Filmic sRGB was still the main one. And to get access to this, you can go ahead and search for it in your file explorer. In my case, it's within this destination, because I have Blender installed on my Steam account, Blender 4.0 data files, color management, and it's this file, config.ocio. And then you choose the input space, Filmic sRGB, and as you can see, we also have AGX available at the bottom now. As for the particles, there's a camera lens blur effect. So if I hit U to bring up the keyframes, actually, let me deselect that and then hit U without having anything selected, which will reveal animated keyframes on every single layer. And you can see that the particles are blurred out at the start. And then over time, the blur kind of goes away and we're left with only 2% of blur. Then we have the main image sequence also scaling down from 150%, because I guess I wanted to zoom in even more. Usually when I'm doing a camera pull or going inwards, even after the camera lands on its final position, I like to still have just a little bit of constant movement, so it very smoothly comes to a stop. Then we have the lens flare on top, which again is the pre-composition back here, which I showed you before. And the opacity is animated, so you can see it more in the beginning, I guess, because you're lower. So the logic was that because the camera angle, the lens flare was a bit more intense. And then we have a bunch of adjustment layers with different kinds of effects. So we have some blur and sharpen. It's very subtle. It kind of gets rid of the digital sharpness first, but then we introduce some contrast back in with the unsharp mask effect. Then we have some color correction, so curves and hue saturation to boost the contrast and the colors. Then my favorite glow effect, which is deep glow, just to add some bloom. Then another color correction on top to dial things back in. Some chromatic aberration, which you're not able to notice much unless I really zoom in quite close. Then we have some vignetting, and the CC vignette effect is actually quite cool because it allows you to pin the highlights, which means wherever there are bright areas in the image, don't add a vignette there. So now it affects everything else besides that part. But with the pin highlights set to 0, it washes out the highlights as well. Then we got some film convert grain, which is one of my favorite things to add. Then for the fade in at the beginning, as I said before, I did animate the intensity of the lights, but then I used the exposure effect to give it a luma fade where we get to see the highlights first and then everything else. And I help that with a black solid on top, which animates from 100% opacity down to 0. So then we get a fade in that's a lot more interesting. Alright guys, we've reached the end, so thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Again, consider supporting the channel and taking a look at various project files available from previous videos. Take care, and we'll see you next time.